now. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks for showing up. So all of you are here because you've been shortlisted for one of the Fall Scholars projects. Some of you have probably already been called for interviews, and some of you are waiting to be called. With me today is Danielle Barkley. She is from the Center for Student Involvement and Careers, and she supports grad students around career education and that kind of support. So she's going to take over after this and give you this next workshop on preparing for your interview. Danielle can tell you more about it, but it's not exactly specific to the Scholars Program, but we just thought it would be useful for those of you who might want to have a refresher or get some tips on interviewing before you step into your interview. So over to you, Danielle.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you all for being here. If you're based in Vancouver, I know it is a beautiful evening out. It seems like we're back in summertime, so I wouldn't have blamed you if you wanted to head to the beach instead. Congratulations on being shortlisted. So today's conversation is, as Karen mentioned, going to focus on ways to prepare for your Sustainability Scholars interview, for interviews in general. I am happy to take questions throughout, so probably the best way to do that since we're recording is to just put them in the chat. If you're ever typing and I move on from something, I'll see the question pop up in the chat. There's potentially also time, maybe at the end we'll stop the recording, and then that way if anyone wants to get on the mic. We can also send around the slides after today's presentation. You can reach out to Karen or I, so if there's anything that you want to come back to, you'll be able to have access to that. Yeah, as Karen mentioned, some of you may know me from the previous session I did on resumes or other work around careers for graduate students. I work out of the Central Career Services, and I work primarily with master's and PhD students. I'm going to skip over this. Oh, just also before I dive in, I mentioned earlier that I was in Vancouver. Some of you might be as well. So I do want to acknowledge that I am in Vancouver giving this workshop on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. It is also today the Orange Shirt Day, so you might notice the bright orange t-shirt I'm wearing. I'll just pop that in the chat. The Orange Shirt Day is an annual day of commemoration of residential schools, the trauma and the suffering that inflicted on many Indigenous children and their families. There's lots of resources and information available through UBC and other places. So if that's something that you'd like to know more about, today next is a really good time to take some time to educate and learn that history. All right, changing focus over to the interviews piece. I think that there's a couple things that I always like to offer right at the beginning. I know that many of you are coming from different fields or different disciplines, and that you're also applying to different places to work on different types of projects. So as we move through today's session, not everything will be the right fit for everyone. I'd really invite you to think, based on your experience. Some of you I know are bringing lots of work experience. Some of you are newer in your professional careers. Some of you are bringing lots of experience, but it's been in primarily sort of a research or an academic setting. So regardless of where you are, I think these interview strategies will just look slightly different depending on how you approach it. And as I said, you're welcome to ask questions in the chat or at the end about what any of these pieces might mean for you. So generally speaking, I think one of the best things you can do as you think about the interview process is to think about it from the employer perspective. I will also say I'm going to use the term employer here. Partner is actually more appropriate in this case. As Sustainability Scholars, your employer is actually UBC, but the individuals who would be interviewing you for the projects that you might be working on. So what do the folks who are interviewing you tend to care about? I think there's really three things primarily that tend to come up. The first, and this is the one most people kind of readily gravitate towards, is skills. Are you able to do the job? Now, I will say in something like a Sustainability Scholars context, this might look a little bit different because one part of these projects is sometimes a fairly strong focus on learning new skills. You might be applying to your chosen project because you want to learn how to do something. So there might be a balance between what you're bringing into the interview and what you're actually going to be learning during your time on that project. We can talk about the way that plays out, but I would expect there'll be some conversation around skills, whether that's survey methodology, whether that's modeling and statistics, whether that's other type of skills and knowledge that you might be bringing from your academic program or from your work experience. Some part of the interview is probably going to be figuring out what you know how to do, what you could potentially learn how to do. The other two pieces, which I think are really important, equally important, maybe even more important in the context of a job interview, are actually around motivation and fit. So you might be highly technically competent, you might be highly qualified for the job. You're probably going to find that the person who's interviewing you is still asking a lot of questions about so why do you want to do this? Why are you interested in being a sustainability scholar? Why did you reach out for this project? Maybe how does it align with your future career goals? And these questions, I think, often reflect kind of two things from the side of the person who's making a hiring decision. Firstly, they're curious about your motivation. As a graduate student who has lots of things on your plate, is this position going to be a priority for you? How are you going to make it a priority? How are you going to find time for it? And how committed are you going to be to following through on the project, following through on the deliverables? The motivation piece, I think, sometimes speaks to those. Someone can be highly skilled, but if they're not bringing that momentum to the work, you may not get to see those skills play out and create value for that project. Fit, we are most likely talking about kind of a remote context. So how you interact with others, how you collaborate might look different. But I think even in remote work, maybe more so in remote work, there's still an expectation that you'll be engaging with other people, that you'll be working with other people. And therefore, a lot of people who are hiring are thinking about how you're going to fit into their existing team, how you're going to work with the individuals who they have already hired. So those are some things that I think you can anticipate they'll care about, and that will translate into some of the questions that might show up during the interview process. Generally speaking, I think there's a few different types of of interviews. So some of the things that you might expect, you might speak with someone one-on-one. So you, one other person, having a Zoom conversation. I'm going to assume that in most cases, this is going to be happening virtually. Karen can let me know or let us know if there is any possibility of in-person, but I'm going to assume most people are going remote and through Zoom or Skype.
Yeah, I think most people can expect to be doing it online by Skype or by Zoom. I know there's one student that's actually having an in-person interview, but I think that's rare.
Okay. Yeah, that would have been my assumption as well. As with most, and that's actually, a good rule around interviews in general. People sometimes have specific choices. I would say that most things are possible, might happen somewhere, but are probably not the norm. The panel, which I think is actually probably the most common type of interview. So you meeting with a group of people from the organization that you're interviewing with. So you may know in advance whether you're meeting with a group of people, and if so, who they are. But just a good thing to keep in mind, I think it's not at all uncommon that you might be interviewing with multiple people at once, and just being prepared for that. I know that can sometimes feel a little nerve-wracking. Group, I don't think is going to be relevant to this context. In other interviewing contexts, it is possible you'll interview kind of as part of a group. And the virtual piece. So I want to touch on that. And feel free to ask questions. This has been a big thing I've been talking with a lot of students about over the past several months. What are some considerations to keep in mind if you are interviewing over that virtual platform? Just a couple really kind of basic things, but that I think are maybe easy to forget about. Depending on what platform they would like you to use, if it is something you haven't used before or you're not familiar with, make sure you download it well ahead of time. Ideally, spend some time kind of checking out the interface so you have a sense of how it works. Ideally, I would say see if you can get on a call with a friend or someone you trust through that platform ahead of time, just so you can see what your screen looks like. You can kind of practice that. I wouldn't want to go into an interview never having used that platform before, just because that's something you can kind of increase your comfort around. This is tricky as we're sharing spaces. I know many people are sharing spaces with roommates, partners, pets, children, extended family, etc. The good thing about an interview is that it's usually fairly time defined, and you'll probably know about that time well in advance. So if you know you have an interview scheduled on Friday from 3 to 4, I would ask the other people who are sharing your space what that time looks like for them. Is it possible that that can be a quieter time? Is there some quieter space that you can find somewhere in your home or wherever your setup is? As far as internet goes, if you do think you might have kind of bandwidth or connection issues, again, is this a time where other people could keep their internet usage to a minimum? Can you physically put yourself in the same room as your router? That tends to improve the connection a little bit. I think it's, important to be flexible, but just do what we can to kind of minimize any of those concerns. I mentioned before setting up the platform and getting a sense of what it all looks like. I know all of you have been doing Zoom for meetings, for your programs, for your classes, but just thinking a little bit about lighting and background, if that's something you haven't given as much thought to, something that you feel fine with talking with a friend or in a classroom setting, you might want to make a few adjustments to if you're talking to a more interview setting. Also, sorry, this is not rocket science, but I forget almost every time I have to do something important over Zoom. So I always try to offer the reminder to other people, close other tabs, put your phone on airplane mode if you can. If there's other things that are beeping at you or sending you notifications, instinctively your eyes are going to go over there to see what it is, and that can appear a little bit distracting during the interview. I've put in a link here to some other tips that I found really actionable and really practical. As I said, many of these things are going to be already very familiar to you, but I did want to spend a couple minutes on it. I also want to take a minute to invite questions in the chat, if there are any. Anything you've been doing in virtual interviews that have been working well for you, any questions that you have about, interviewing in a digital context. All right, as I mentioned, if you're typing, keep going. I'll see it pop up and I'm happy to come back to it, so don't worry about that. I want to spend some time on some of the common categories of interview questions that you can expect might come up. I'll tell you a little bit about what each of these categories mean, and then we'll spend some time talking about strategies for the different ones. Scenario or situational is asking you to predict a situation that might happen in the course of the job or the project and to respond to how you would handle that situation. So if you are going to be, expected to be presenting information to a group of stakeholders, you might get a question about what if at the last minute you realize you don't have a key piece of data you need for your presentation? How would you handle that? Or, that sounds very grim, but just like a possible situation that's reasonable in regards to that job, and be asked to talk about how you would handle it. I do see a question in the chat, so I'll come to that in just 1 second. Behavioral works in a similar way. So you're also being asked to sort of speak to your behavior, but rather than predicting a future situation, how would you? You're often being asked to go back and talk about your past behavior in a professional situation. So these questions often sound like, tell me about a time when. So tell me about a time when you disagreed with a supervisor and how you handled that. Or tell me about a time when you solved a problem in a creative way. You're being asked to speak to something that's already happened in order to give someone a sense of how you approach those situations. Take a look in the chat and then come back to this. Yeah, so great suggestion. Background and video prior to the interview. And yeah, if you are using notes, and I think using notes is fine, you do want to place them somewhere, whether that's a second monitor or paper pasted up somewhere, somewhere where you can kind of look at them in a discrete
way without kind of taking your attention away from the screen too much. If you are taking notes where you actually want to write stuff down, I think that's okay. That might be appropriate in an interview context. In that case, I might just let them know that, I'm going to be taking notes at a couple points. So if you see me off to the side. And just to speak to that, I would also anticipate that whoever's interviewing you might well be taking notes either on paper or maybe in a Word document. So if they're kind of looking off other places, that might well be what's happening. Technical questions are, going to vary depending on the nature of the job that you're applying to or the focus on the skills. So they might ask you about your experience doing specific things or using specific software or tools. This might be where things come up, questions around something you're not familiar with. So a good way to handle sort of a technical question that you're not familiar with, I think you want to be honest about that. It's probably better to just be transparent than try to bluff your way kind of through it and potentially end up in a situation that's not ideal. But I think you can also be positive and curious, right? If someone's asking about some technical knowledge or a skill, they probably want to get a sense of how open are you to learning that? And also, what do you have in place already that would speak to your ability to learn that? So if you're being asked about something you don't have a lot of familiarity with, what do you know about it? Do you have any exposure to it? Why would you be curious about learning it? And maybe an example of a time where you've learned something or maybe self-taught another skill. That can be really reassuring to hear someone say, no, I'm not familiar with Tableau, but here's another tool similar that I actually had to self-teach myself when I started my master's research because I realized it would be really useful. That reassures an employer that you are comfortable with that process and that you can autonomously develop some of the skills that you might need. Out of the box or abstract, if anyone wants to type in the chat, what's the weirdest or the funniest interview question you've been asked or of someone having been asked? I'll take a pause because there's always some good answers that come up. What's the strangest interview question you've heard of? Some kind of personal questions. Okay, so depending on how you're defining personal, that might fit more into the next category. So personal could mean, so there is an example, which fruit best defines you? So I'm not sure what you mean by personal, Sadia, and also I apologize if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name. So I often think of out of the box or abstract kind of being a couple categories. There's often the what fruit, tree, animal, etc. best defines you. You might also get, how do you clear cookies on your computer? I would be at a loss with that one. Or, what's your superpower? If you could have dinner with any person living or dead, who would you most want to meet? Sometimes, and this might be kind of what the personal question was referring to, sometimes it's like, what's your favorite podcast? Or what's the last great book that you read? Sometimes it's just a way to kind of get to know you better. So what I would say about most of those questions that fall in those type of categories is it's a chance to sort of see how someone responds to something that's a bit more spontaneous, that probably they haven't explicitly prepared for. It might be a way to sort of see how someone responds to being caught off guard. If the role is going to involve answering questions, how do you react to questions being kind of put out there spontaneously? And maybe depending on the context and the type of job, do you have a sense of humor? Are you able to kind of, even in a moment of stress, in a moment where you're trying to do your best, are you still able to kind of build rapport? So if it's that type of question, I'll take the fruit example because I think that's great. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is there probably isn't a right answer or a better answer. I don't think your ability to do a job well is going to rest on whether you say you'd be a banana or a strawberry, but just kind of having a bit of a sense of playfulness, a bit of a sense of openness around it. If it's something about like how do you clear cookies on your computer, that might be more, I guess, unless the role was technical and that was part of the technical skill set you might need, it might be a way of sort of seeing how you logic through that approach as well. With the allusion to personal questions, I do just want to touch on the last category here. In a BC, in a Canadian context, there are some questions such as like marital status, race, religion, political affiliation, anything like that, that really shouldn't be asked in an interview because they they shouldn't influence the hiring decision. And there's really no reason for someone in a professional context to have that information. So I don't think this is common. I think especially for the Sustainability Scholar interview, you're working with very well-known, well-reputed employers where I don't think that's going to come up. But if in other contexts, there ever is a question that feels overly personal or like it's asking about your personal life in that way, my go-to, I think, is to just kind of neutral tone, calmly, like, oh, that's interesting. Can you tell me a bit more about why you're asking that question? Or I'm curious about what leads you to ask that question. Usually that gives someone a minute to kind of register and think about, what they've asked. We can speak more about that if you would like, but I think that's highly unlikely to come up in this particular context. Yeah, I was touching on this before. Okay, well, so the interesting example in the chat. And I think in that case, right, so I would sort of see that as a ethical type of question. And if the context is it's a summer camp job, that actually might very well be a situation that is within the range of what you could possibly expect. And thanks for that example. I think what that offers is, right, a flag that like, one question that might be quite strange in the context of one interview might make total sense in the context of another. So a great thing to kind of keep in mind is like, does this question make sense in the context of the job that you're thinking about? And I would see that as sort of, an ethical question. It's certainly not uncommon for people to get questions about like, if you knew that a coworker was engaging in some sort of inappropriate or illegal activity, how would you handle that? What steps would you take if you knew something was going on? That's something that could come up, but I think that's also a good example that you'll typically find the questions line up with what's likely to arise within the scope of that job. Anything else around different types of questions or questions you've heard before? A few just kind of principles or ideas that I think are sometimes helpful to have in mind as you think about interviewing. I always think this first one is like a nice thing to just make it a little bit easier for everybody. And it's easy to think that interviews are, a chance for someone to like interrogate you or cross-examine you or ask the toughest questions that they can. It's possible they might ask you some questions that you find challenging or, ask you about things that you find a bit stressful to talk about. But generally speaking, I think most people want to like you. They want to hear about your strengths. They want to hear about the good things you can bring to a job. It makes their life easier if you turn out to be a really strong candidate. So I think if you go in with the assumption that they are looking for your strengths and that you are going in to sort of showcase your strengths and showcase your skills, in some cases that might not be the right match for the job. But I think that shifts the sort of frame and the tone of the interview away from anything sort of combative or challenging to like, we're figuring out whether this is a good fit for both of us. I heard someone say recently, and I thought it was really interesting, like approach an interview as if you were two people deciding if you were going to collaborate on a project together. And I think that's really true. There is a power balance. Of course, they are, in a position to offer you this opportunity or not, but you're also in the position to decide if that's the project you want to work on, if this is the way you want to spend your time in the coming months, so that both of you are trying to figure out whether this makes sense. Which takes us into the second point. For sure, you have agency in this process. This is an opportunity for you to get to know the people you'd be working with, to have a sense of, is this going to get you what you're hoping for, the opportunities that you're looking to learn. And then the final one of the reframes that I think is worth considering Sometimes when students are applying to positions, and especially for a position like the sustainability scholars, where there is often a focus on learning, on trying something new, on kind of expanding your skill set, sometimes the focus on the interview becomes you telling them all the great things you could learn, or like how great being a sustainability scholar would be for you. And that's, fair. You can certainly touch on those things that can help you communicate your motivation. I think you also want to tell them how great it would be for them if you were working on the project. So finding that balance between communicating what you would gain from this opportunity, but also the value that you could contribute. Given that all of you have been shortlisted, I'm going to assume that when you submitted your resumes, when you submitted your cover letters, you were doing a pretty effective job of communicating your skills, of communicating your value. So that's a good thing to go back to, right? What were some of the things you mentioned about why this was a good fit, about why you were looking for this opportunity, and just anchoring that interview in that emphasis on the skills you have. Maybe they're transferable, the other types of experiences you've had, even if they were in a different context. All right, I want to spend some time just touching on some of the common questions. Pretty often, like probably most of the time, interviews are going to start with some version of tell me about yourself. So it might be, tell me about yourself and why do you want to work here? Tell me about yourself and what you know about this project. But usually there's going to be this fairly general question at the start. And there's a number of different ways you can answer this. You can really think about what works best for you. I tend to think there's a few key pieces of information that are helpful to get across here. They don't have to be in this order necessarily, but it makes a neat acronym to do it this way. So what are some of those skills that you're bringing? Again, maybe you haven't done exactly this type of project before, but what are some skills you do bring from your academic experience, from your previous professional experience, if you have that? You can also think about volunteer or leadership. What would you say are some of the key things you're bringing? Experiences, so not everything you've ever done, but are there one or two experiences that you think are helpful in preparing you for that job? Maybe that's been writing your thesis, maybe that's a previous co-op role or a job you've had previously. Just mentioning one or two. You'll come back to these in more detail. You'll have other experiences to talk about them, but this is a good way to kind of plant the seed of the things you'd like to spend more time talking about. Academic, so I think it's often helpful to touch briefly on your current academic program. That might mean mentioning a specialization or a capstone project or a type of research you focus on. If that connects to the job, if you think there's something about your academic experience that is, again, helping you to be a good candidate, you can certainly mention that. So why does your program help you to be a good fit? And then I call this personal, and I think this can sound kind of one of two ways. One model is kind of like the fun fact, right? So when I'm not busy with my program in SCARP, I'm also an amateur violinist, or I enjoy hiking on the North Shore, or just like a quick fun fact hobby mention, if that's something that you're comfortable with and that you'd like to offer. The other way to approach it is kind of to think about your why, or maybe something again about the motivation piece. So if there's something about this project or this organization that you care about, that aligns with your values, might be a nice time to just say quickly in one or two sentences, why are you motivated to work on this project, or how are those pieces kind of reflected together? As I said before, you can kind of do this in any order, and you might spend more time on one section than another. But I would say that these are primarily the main pieces that you want to get across in the tell me about yourself answer. And the one thing I might sort of think about is organizing according to these different pieces that you want to communicate, not necessarily chronologically. A lot of people, our brains work chronologically. We think, okay, I'll start with the beginning and work up to now. But sometimes what that means is you start off with tell me about yourself with well, I was born in a small town in Alberta, and then when I was 7, I moved to Ottawa, and we had a dog named Coco, and then next thing you know, you're kind of getting bogged down in the details. So I think getting organized around some of these key pieces and knowing what you want to cover in this answer helps you to stay focused, and it doesn't have to be a begin at the beginning and work your way up till now. Although, you know, there may be cases where that career progression made sense. After working in this field for 2 years, I decided I wanted to pivot, and that's how I ended up at UBC, specializing in clean energy or whatever it is. Any questions about the tell me about yourself question or ways that you would approach it? Feel free to let me know if other questions come up. Oh, there we go. Yeah, thanks. Great question. How long to take on that answer? I tend to think 1 to 2 minutes is probably average. I would sort of plan it out, plan some of the content that you want to cover, practice it, sort of see where you end up, what feels comfortable. But I would say like, yeah, 1.5 to 2 minutes is probably typically where you want to be for most of your answers. It can certainly be longer and it can certainly be shorter. Some of it's going to depend on the questions they're asking. But I would think that that's often a good starting place. And you can always kind of pause and say, like, is there anything you want me to expand on? Is there anything else you'd like me to add? And that gives them the opportunity to tell you if there's something they were really interested in and they want you to go back to it, or there's some pieces they want you to build out. But I think kind of aiming for about a couple minutes is usually a comfortable place to start with most answers, unless they're very specific and very short, or, you know, unless they're quite lengthy and quite complex. And that's also a good answer because it takes us nicely into the next kind of framework I wanted to offer. So I mentioned earlier that the behavioral questions are often the ones that sound like, tell us about a time when, and you're being asked to reflect on something that happened in your previous professional experience. So really you're telling a story. You're telling a story about something that's happened in your past. And one good model that could help to keep that organized and to make sure you get the points across that you were thinking about is the STAR acronym. There's lots of resources around this out there if you're looking for resources around interview prep. But I would think about situation. So what's the context? Was this in your last job, on an internship you had last summer, in a group project you're currently working on as part of your master's? The task. So just what was happening? Was there a result you were trying to get, a deliverable, a problem you were facing? What was your actions? So what were the steps you took to resolve that problem or to get to where you wanted to go? What was the result? What came out of it? Did things get better, get worse? How did you kind of readjust? And then maybe, you don't always have to do this, but I think it's sometimes helpful, relevance. So I've just told you this story. Maybe I want to cap it off by actually explaining, here's how I think this relates to the particular job that I'm applying to. Sometimes that will be more clear than others. If you're using this model or you're using this framework, you want to spend most of your time on the actions and the results. And sometimes where people want to spend most of their time is the situation and the task, kind of explaining those details. I think that that's kind of just like, I think about it as like the runway before the story takes off. You want enough context to make sure someone understands the story and that they know kind of where and when it was happening, but that the action and the results are where you want to spend the majority of your time. Good question. So in a situation where you've not had such an, where, you know, so a common example might be, tell me about a time where you experienced conflict in the workplace. And, you know, fair enough, maybe that's never really come up for you. So I think you can be transparent about that. What I would say is then turn the question into, how would I handle it? So, you know, for me so far, I haven't really experienced a lot of conflict in my professional experiences. Here's some of the ways I would approach it if it were to happen. That shows that you're thinking proactively about it, that you have some strategies available, that you've thought about how you would approach that situation. So I do think for some of these cases, it is helpful to think about not just what's the story you would tell, but if there was something that you didn't have an example for, what would you talk about as ways you're prepared to deal with it or prepared if it did come up. The other thing that can sometimes help with the like, what if I've never experienced it before, is you also don't have to confine this strictly to like the paid workplace. Is there something that's come up in the classroom setting? Is there something that's come up in volunteering or leadership or extracurricular, any clubs or community work that you do? Sometimes if we think a little bit more holistically about all the things that have happened, not just like paid work experience, you might be able to find some other examples. And most of the time people are happy to hear about those examples because it does allow you to talk about how you've shown up. But if it's truly something you haven't experienced before, I would just be transparent about that and then speak to how you would approach it if it did come up. And happy to take other questions about preparation or about behavioral questions before I dive in here. So a couple thoughts on this. It's probably not going to be possible to predict every interview question you might be asked. So rather than thinking I'm going to come up with 100 questions and 100 different answers for each of them, I would try to think about what are some of the examples or the stories that I want to share, and then could I use the same story for more than one question? So often the same example could be used to respond to a question about leadership, but it could also be used to respond to a question about working under pressure. You might, tell the story a little bit differently, but I think if you have, a good 6 or 7 examples, stories from different experiences, you can often use these depending on the exact question you're asked, and that gives you a bit more flexibility. The other way I would approach this is, take a look at the project description. Based on what you understand this project to be about, what do you think they're really going to care about? And do you have examples that reflect that? If they're making it very clear in the description that this is going to require someone who's detail-oriented, do you have some examples of times where you've shown that quality? If it's really going to be about like creatively solving problems and coming up with new ideas, do you have some examples where you've done that in the past? That will kind of allow you to probably have examples that line up well with the job. I do think it's helpful to practice delivering some of your answers. You could consider recording it, especially videoing. I know it's awkward, but even if you do it for like 1 or 2 questions, it's a good way to kind of practice and get a sense of how you're responding, or practice with a friend. I do think that practicing out loud is important. Even if you've wrote some notes or you've scripted it, it helps you to kind of get that comfort level. This is, individual. You'll know what works best for you. I'm not a huge fan of trying to memorize an answer like word for word, because I think what often happens is, naturally enough, people forget the exact wording, but then they're worrying about trying to remember the words they used rather than just telling the same story in different words. So I think sort of knowing the content you want to get across, having some notes about it, but I don't think you necessarily want to prepare a script, and sometimes that can come across sounding a little bit artificial. I have a note in here about logistics. In some senses, the virtual often takes care of a lot of that, but we talked about any of those pieces around strategies for a virtual interview. And I would add to that, right, having been really prepared with what you can learn about the project, what you can learn about the prospective partner. So if you're interviewing with the City of Vancouver or, wherever it might be, have you spent some good time on their website? Have you spent some time maybe looking at previous projects they've partnered on in other cycles of the Sustainability Scholars? Doing your due diligence to get a sense of the information that might really support you in the interview.
Danielle, do you talk about references upcoming, or is this the time to talk about references?
This would be a great time to talk about it.
Right, so all the students were asked to provide 2 references with their applications, and I know some may not have, and some may have decided they want different references. So definitely I'd suggest that there's preparation in that regard. I guess, Danielle, I'll let you speak about it, but that's the
Yeah, Karen, and I'm just curious. It sounds like it would then be appropriate to bring or share some updated reference information during the interview or after the interview?
I think because we're trying to do everything really quickly, it would be at the time of the interview would be to be able to provide your references afterwards. I guess I'm also thinking of more of a paper-based environment than this virtual one, but yeah, to be able to email them or provide them if you haven't already at the time of the interview, rather than waiting, because we're trying to crank through all of this pretty quickly.
Yeah, so great point. I would say, in general, if you're asked for anything in the interview, either emailing it pretty promptly afterwards, if they have the option to just upload it directly in the chat. But yes, anything you're asked to provide or that you want them to consider, the sooner you can get that to them, the easier that makes the decision-making process. And, for you as a candidate, you ideally want the process to go quickly so that you can get your answers back and have your own information around that. Good question. How formal should we dress for the remote interviewing? I can offer some general comments, and then Karen, I'll let you sort of speak to the specific context. I think that you want to look slightly more dressed up than you would look on an average day if you were in that job. And of course, knowing that we're working remotely, the average day might be pretty casual for a lot of us if we're not on camera. So I would think, unless it's a very, very formal workplace, you probably don't need to go sort of suit and tie route, but I would go kind of business casual, maybe a shirt with a collar if that's something you're comfortable with, certainly sort of clean, put together, looking like, you were aware you had this interview and you prepared for it ahead of time. You can spend some time, on the website of the organization. If they're sharing images there, that might give you some cues of their expectation of dress. Karen, I don't know if you had thoughts around that in this specific context.
Yeah, I think looking at all the organizations, these are all like nonprofits, non-government organizations, a little bit smaller. So they're probably a lot more casual than some of the bigger organizations you'd encounter. So I think business casual, nice and tidy, at least from the whatever shoulders up, is probably good enough. I'm sure that most of the people you talk to wear jeans in the office, but I think it's good to bring it up just a tiny bit from that.
Yeah, I would anticipate that you will probably look a bit more dressed up than the people who are interviewing you do. I think that's fine. In fact, that's probably a good thing. And, especially in some ways in the Zoom context, my other thought around dressing for interviews is like things you can kind of modify. So if you want to start off with a blazer, if that feels too formal once you're on camera, it's pretty easy to sort of take that off and then have, the shirt you have underneath. So like maybe something that's also a little bit adjustable or customizable if you get the sense where it falls on the spectrum. All right, another question that I think is likely to come up and that it's helpful to spend some time preparing for is being asked to talk about either your strengths or your weaknesses, or both. And I think both of these are somewhat tough questions, often for different reasons. So strengths, people often sometimes find a little bit challenging to talk about because it can feel sort of uncomfortable. I've had a lot of people say like it feels like I'm bragging, or it makes me feel like I'm like taking credit for things that I did as part of a group or that I did collectively. But I think the employer who's asking about your strengths, like they're looking for self-awareness. They want to see sort of, have you thought about some of the things that you know to be areas of strength for yourself? And are you sort of comfortable talking about, again, that value you can bring to a specific project? So I think it's helpful to have, 2 or 3 that you would be comfortable talking about. You probably don't need more than that. And I would pick ones, again, that match up with your targeted role. So given, what we know about remote work, about the way these projects are set up, maybe you want to highlight your ability to really consistently meet deadlines or to work independently, or your strong research skills, or, picking things that sort of align and that you'd be likely to use while you were doing this particular project. The important thing, kind of like the STAR method, have an example ready, right? Because we can say that, we're good at this thing, but what's a time when you've actually demonstrated that? And if you do feel a little bit sort of shy or uncomfortable talking about your strengths, I think that evidence is really going to be an asset for you, because then you're conveying information that is objectively true. There's something that you have to support this claim that you're making, and that there's a reason that an employer is asking for that information. Weaknesses people often dislike talking about. At the same time, it's a really common interview question, so I would be prepared to answer it. And I think the reason someone potentially wants you to talk about your weaknesses is, again, that self-awareness piece. Do you know what some of the places where you have potential to grow or potential to work on is? Are you able to take feedback? Are you open to thinking about ways that you can develop yourself? So I would avoid saying I don't have any weaknesses. We all do. It's just kind of a question of taking the time to figure out what that might be. And I think it's up to you. I think, in recent years, some people have gotten a little bit skeptical of answers like, oh, I'm a perfectionist, or sometimes I work too hard, which is tricky because that truly is a weakness for some people, maybe a lot of people. But I might be a little bit cautious about those type of answers because I know they're sometimes met with a bit of skepticism. This doesn't have to be something that's caused a huge problem. I really like the framing of like sometimes or occasionally this comes up for me. And I think the most important thing is focusing on what are you doing about it. So if you know that public speaking and presentations have been something that's been challenging for you, how have you been investing in your skill set around that? If you know that you tend to be really task focused and you could do better at kind of building relationships and building your network, what have you been doing to kind of work on that? If you're actually seeing signs of improvement, if you can say something about like, here's a measure or an indicator that I'm getting better in this area, that's a really powerful thing to share as well. But I think this is a good place to be honest and authentic. I would take the time before the interview to think about something that you genuinely are working on, be honest about it, and then, say, what is it that I'm doing in order to get better in this area? Salary, sorry, I include this in another, from another version. Won't really be relevant in this case because the information is fixed. But if you are thinking about future interviews, feel free to kind of reach out to me or we can chat about that. I'll leave it in the slide deck if that's helpful for other contexts.
Yeah, but just to stress that it is fixed. There's unfortunately no room to negotiate the salaries for the Scholars projects just because of the way we get the funding. So yeah, have to smile and enjoy that. It's a great experience.
Yeah, and I think, for many of you, if you're in teaching assistant positions or research assistant positions, or even many of our work learn opportunities at UBC, that's a reality that many of these will be on a structured scale as far as salary. It also actually makes things a little bit easier because then you don't have to have that conversation. But for future employment and future professional opportunities, it's not a bad thing to think about in other interview iterations. All right, as you come to the end of the interview, one thing that they might ask, or that they probably will ask, is, do you have any questions for us? I would prep 1 or 2 questions beforehand. It's interesting. I didn't realize how much this mattered until I started interviewing candidates myself. And the ones who, if we came to the end of the interview and I asked if they had any questions, if they were like, no, I'm good. Even if the interview had been quite strong up until that point, it really created the impression that they weren't that engaged and that they just weren't that interested in the position. So in my mind, it's just an easy thing to end the interview on a strong note. Also knowing that there's a bias towards whatever happens at the end when someone's thinking about that interview the next day or 2 days later, probably what's going to stick in their mind is the latter half or that final portion. So I would have a couple questions that you hope to ask. In terms of what those questions are, so firstly, this is a great time to get any clarification. So if there's anything you're just not sure about as far as the role or what it would involve or how it would work, it's a really good time to get that information. That will help you also assess, is this position going to be a good fit for you? It's reasonable to just say, what's your timeline for the next steps? You do want to know that there might be flexibility around this. It might take longer than they suggest, but it's a good idea for you to have a bit of a sense of, are they hoping to make a decision this week, next week, later on? And then I also like to ask one big picture question. So, when you think about this project, what are the skills someone would really need to succeed at it? How would you measure the success of the person on this project? Are there any challenges that you can think of associated with it? There's other types of questions you can ask as well. I think there's lots of things that could work here. But something that shows that you're reflecting on the opportunity and that you're reflecting on how you might fit into it. You don't need to ask tons of questions. I would be mindful that the person might have other things scheduled or they might be trying to wrap up. So I think 1 or 2 is fine, but I think it's a good way to kind of open up the conversation. It's also a really good chance for you, again, to get more information about the opportunity, about the project, to get a taste of whether this is going to be of interest to you, whether it's going to be a good fit for you. And then, I know there's different schools of thought about this. I don't think it ever hurts to send a very short thank you email kind of within the first day or 2. It really can literally be 1 or 2 sentences. I really appreciated speaking with you about this position. If there's one thing that stood out for you, mentioning that. It doesn't have to be long, but I don't think it's ever going to hurt. And it's fairly low cost to be able to potentially get some benefits from it. We were touching on this earlier, but if there is reference information or anything else they need, I'd follow up with that as quickly as possible. That's also a way of kind of showing your professionalism, responding to emails promptly, sort of supporting them in making that decision quickly if they'd like to. It sounds like things are going to move along fairly quickly, so this might not be as much of a piece. In other circumstances, you can think about following up. That might be something that comes up for other types of jobs, but I would say it sounds like the process is going to go fairly quickly here, so there probably won't be as much of a need for that. And Karen, can you just let me know where we are for time?
It's just a couple minutes before 6, so I think I've actually got another half an hour here, but we've got a bit more time if you're trying to wrap up. It's 5:57.
Perfect. Yeah. And I mean, I can stick around for questions, but I thought if we could get through the core content, knowing that some folks probably do have to pop out, I'm happy to go back to anything. If there's anything else that you want to touch on, if you do have some more specific questions, feel free. I don't know, Karen, do you want to stop the recording at this point or do you want to keep